Every day in 2021, more than 27 Canadians died by the hands of their physicians or nurses. That's double the suicide rate.
Welcome to Life on Film. My name is Josie Luetke. I'm the Director of Education and Advocacy for Campaign Life Coalition and one of the members of the National March for Life Organizing Committee. And co-hosting this screening with me this evening is a new member of our organizing committee, Gideon.
Hello, my name is Gideon Spevak, and I'm one of CLC's new youth coordinators. I'd like to introduce our guests, Matthew and Daniel Kooman, who we've previously interviewed on Life on Film. This evening we'll be showing the third chapter of their MAiD in Canada series on euthanasia and ethics. Matthew and Daniel, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Yeah, thanks guys. Good to be here.
Thanks for having us.
So as mentioned, this is chapter 3 of MAiD in Canada. So it's possible that some of our viewers have already watched chapters 1 and 2. They might be a little bit familiar with who you are, but for those viewers who are new to the series, who are joining us for the first time, can you let us know what motivated you to create MAiD in Canada in the first place?
Yeah, and we're filmmakers from Canada, born and raised. We've always told stories of human interest and human interest that really connect on a personal level for us, either through our faith journeys or in our communities, things that really impact just the value of life. We've always pursued stories that highlight the value of each individual life. And I think when we realized how significant the issue of MAiD was in Canada, I feel like we even came to the story late, feeling like, man, nobody's telling stories about how significant this is for our culture and for our society, and how we're not valuing each individual and the lives and people's struggles and what they really are after in life, which is purpose. And that just drew us to this story. Canada is something we're passionate about and have always been proud of. And this is something that doesn't make us proud to be Canadian. And so we really felt motivated to get involved. As filmmakers, it's what we can do. We tell stories. We're not doctors. We're not ethicists or working in government, but we make films. And so for us, we could produce something that helps to share other people's stories and get information out for awareness raising, and hopefully get more people aware that we need to talk about this and we need to do something about it.
Well, thank you so much for doing the work that you are. I just want to ask, there may be some people watching this episode right now who have a family member who's in hospital, and either they or their family are considering euthanasia as an option. What sort of approach can people like us, what can we take to display a strong, life-affirming stance and to show really how meaningful every last breath is?
Yeah, one of the things that we've experienced with our own family and why we can speak to this directly is some of the most significant moments in a person's life transpire in the last days, the last months, the last moments, sometimes literally the last breaths. There are stories you will hear across the board internationally, but in Canada, of course, of family members who had some of their most precious moments with a loved one at the last part of their life, not at a euthanasia bed where they were saying goodbye, because when you tell those stories, you actually hear about the pain and the sorrow that grips people's hearts with. Interestingly enough, and tragically, during the making of this MAiD in Canada series, which we've been doing over the last year, we're now into our 6th episode where we've completed 5 and we have a 6th and final episode we're working on. In the time that we've been working on this project, 2 of our own family members have done MAiD. And that's a crazy thought, for one, because we're literally making a story about why we believe that this is not the option or the choice to make, and that it's not about autonomy and all these different things that have been told to us. But it just shows how convoluted the issue has become. And I think our stance, at least mine, is that every one of those breaths is precious. It's a gift from God. We breathe 20,000 times a day. Every single one of them is a gift. When you're breathing, you have life. When you choose to end it, your existence on this plane ceases. And those moments get taken away where a family member would have been able to be at your side, would have been able to hold your hand, would have been able to encourage you, would have been able to connect with you, would have, even if there's not verbal communication, there's this incredible spiritual connection that can take place in those last days, last months, even in the midst of, as we've heard in many of our interviews, in the midst of suffering. There's this amazing opportunity, especially if you lean in on a spiritual side, to have connection with loved ones, even in the midst of suffering. There's actually arguably even a deeper connection in the midst of suffering. Mm-hmm. So I think that what's being taken away from people is actually, it's suffering, like do not suffer at any cost is kind of the message that was being sent. And we don't believe that that has any gravitas with history, with the thousands of years of human history that have transpired. In the midst of some of humanity's darkest sufferings, there's been some of the most profound spiritual connections and even connections with God. And so, yeah, we just see that it is actually a robbery from a person's life. And what we want to really, for those that are suffering right now, we want to encourage you and say, in the midst of your suffering, can you see the loved ones around you? Can you see the people that want every last minute with you? Can you look to God, who is your maker, and be thankful for every breath that you do have? And that's easier to say when I'm not physically suffering right now. And that's the argument we sometimes hear back is, well, you don't know what I'm going through. Mm-hmm. And I don't discount that, but I just want to have people hear that there is encouragement in the midst of it. And that's why I think as family members, as community members, as whether it's churches or community groups, all those people, we need to come together. And I think actually Kevin Dunn, who is featured in episode 3, speaks to that really well, is like, we need to come around these people and we need to actually, community is a huge part of the solution.
And I think also, we as a community, we need to take responsibility that we have an involvement in people who are suffering, to be compassionate, to show love, to be a neighbor, to be a loving father or brother. That is, people need to take onus on their involvement in what other people are going through, and find a way through to show love and to be available. And I think one thing our culture is currently failing at is being there for one another. We create these little isolation hubs, and COVID was a great setup for this too. Lock everybody down, hide out, don't be with each other. That's so destructive. We need to be with each other. When people were in the hospital suffering and dying alone during COVID, some people were dying because they were lonely. For sure that was happening. And with MAiD, we just see this time and time again, the stories we're hearing, and the family members. I didn't even know that person was going through such a hard time, or whatever the story is. And this is the nature with people who are dealing with suicide and that kind of thing as well. We need to be more connected. We need to be better with each other, and we need to love one another and show each other compassion.
My condolences.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to hear about your family members who were euthanized, and I'm sorry that loss was compounded by the grief of knowing that you were denied, their final moments or final days, weeks, or whatever it was. It was actually something I was talking to Bronwyn Gray about last month. She was our Life on Film guest. She created the short film Worth More. She was also talking about how her mom, who passed away, thankfully she wasn't euthanized, but in her last days, she was able to reconcile with Bronwyn's father because the two had been apart. So just as you were saying that, in fact, the ends of our lives can be so significant, and they're not just like a waste of time that we're just living out just for the sake of living them out. They can be incredibly meaningful. Mm-hmm. So I'm really excited to watch chapter 3. I love having discussions about ethics. When I was in university, I took as many classes on ethics as I could. So I'm honored to now present Chapter 3 of Made in Canada. I just want to remind viewers to stick around until after the credit roll. Our discussion with Matthew and Daniel will be continuing then. We'll talk about what they've gleaned making this series and updates on euthanasia in Canada. Anyway, here it is, Chapter 3 of Made in Canada. And we're back. Once again, I'm Josie Luetke. I'm joined by my colleague, Gideon Spevak, and the directors and producers of Made in Canada, Daniel and Matthew Kooman. Again, thank you for joining me. The first thing I want to talk about is the language we're using in Made in Canada. Obviously, that's a play on words. In other contexts, MAiD actually really bugs me for the reasons that Derek Ross and Nicole Scheidel pointed out in Chapter 3, which is called Ethics and Euthanasia. So I'm wondering how you navigated the question of what terms to use when everyone has different preferences.
Yeah, I think that was definitely the double entendre with the title. It's suggesting that we used to be known for manufacturing and creating great things, and of course the nuance of the spelling of MAiD. It's like this is something that could have only really been made in Canada because of the way that our culture has kind of shifted, this extreme secularism that Canada has become known for. And of course, that played into the title, but that was one of the first things that in our interviews with doctors and ethicists and people that have really spent time on this issue is just how damaging language can be. And as soon as you talk to people, and I think, Blaise Alain, that's in the episode there, talks specifically about having the conversation with people of what do you think about assisted suicide? What do you think about suicide? And when you have the right words, it really is compelling to see the look on people's faces and how they respond to these different issues. And there was notably in the medical system, the people that pushed and actually shifted from euthanasia to assisted suicide to MAiD is MAiD it's innocuous. It doesn't sound like something that is scary or, it doesn't have the social and other spiritual connotation of a word like suicide, and something that, I'm not sure if it's this episode or another where we have lawyers, talking about how the criminal code had to literally be changed and create these avenues where there was exclusions literally within the homicide laws so that this, which is homicide, is now not homicide, and so it is so. It's not even blurry, actually. It's like ethically abominable, and it's like just how they've used language now. And it's been very, purposeful, the shift in language and tone. And I think one of the examples that speaks to that most profoundly in terms of if you want statistics is the one comparing, the animation on California's number of assisted suicides versus the euthanasia deaths in Canada. And it's a 20 times multiple in Canada. And that literally could be primarily attributed to language. So when you change the language and you change the laws and you water things down, and one of the things that is profound in some of the conversations we've had even offline outside of the series is how people begin to think that when a law is in place, that it's actually okay. So when you think about how dangerous and weaponized law, it's, some people call it lawfare, right? Is you have these laws that can be weaponized against us, the citizens of a country, because suddenly you think something is like, oh, that seems nice or that seems easy, but you're not getting the full picture and the full story. And that's why as filmmakers and storytellers, that's kind of an angle we've tried to approach it, is like, what is the language? Like, how do we talk about this? When we have the right words in the conversation, it doesn't even have to be kind of like offensive. It's just like, here are the actual words. What do you think about it now? And I think that that's one of the things that can make the conversation about it easier for viewers when you're having this conversation, because the news flash is this will hit every family in this country. This will at some point be a story that all of us have to grapple with. We can't turn away from it because it's already part of all of our lives to some degree, but it will be part of your life in a greater degree because of the way that the laws are changing and expanding, the talk about, mental health as soul condition, all the different pieces that are coming down the pipeline. So I think that being educated now and having those words, that language is so important.
Yeah, and it is a Canadian, it's a made up term from Canada. It is made itself is made in Canada. That's no one else uses that. That's what Canadians say it is. And as David Lametti, who is the Attorney General and the Justice Minister at the beginning of all this, has said on Canada, one of Canada's biggest news shows, he said it's a species of suicide. That's how he termed it, quote unquote. And so even one of the founders of this program, or definitely one of its biggest proponents, was saying it in that language. So it's interesting how you can pick and choose when to use the language, and when you're using it as to change the laws, you call it medical assistance in dying, and instead of assisted suicide or whatever the words are that people would be more negatively associating the term. So it is definitely made in Canada, this whole issue, and we've got to wake up and try to do something about it.
You make a really interesting point about the law in Canada, and it seems to me that one of the major differences between us and the United States is that they're much more okay with repealing a whole bunch of laws, and the next guy comes in and changing everything, and that isn't so common in Canada, I don't find. It seems to me, though, that with the potential incoming Poilievre-led government, this issue may be addressed to some degree, although I predict we may find their prescriptions somewhat unsatisfactory. Poilievre has said he would repeal the law that allows the mentally ill to seek euthanasia, and he has warned about a slippery slope on this issue. I mean, I know we're talking about politicians here, but how do you think we keep the government accountable on this and other social issues? And often they'll cite the slippery slope. They'll say everything they think that the constituents want to hear, but they'll take half measures. And how do we prevent them from slipping back down the slippery slope?
Yeah, well, you're comparing our governmental system to a completely different system in the States. I think what we're learning right now is how much power our government does have to create culture and change law through that. And one of the biggest encouragements it's discouraging on one side, but it's very encouraging on the other, is that it's not very many people who are pushing through these draconian ideas and getting them into law. It's not that many people. Now that's really discouraging, because how can that be possible in our amazing free democracy that we have here in Canada? But what's encouraging is that once people start talking about it and sharing their true displeasure with what the plan is, which happened with the issue of mental health being a sole condition, and once people learned that that was possible and was on the table last March, I don't know if you recall this, but it stopped. Everybody put a pause on it because there was an outcry of disdain for that plan. That's because people were aware. They realized, no, this couldn't be possible. Then it was happening, and they started speaking up and saying, no, this isn't right. We can't do that. So once people were made aware, realized that their voice was a lot bigger than the few bullies, in the boardroom that we have in Parliament, we were able to make a change. And so Canada is shapeable by people doing the right thing if we get together and do that. Too often we sit back and we don't say anything, and we don't do anything because we're polite, we're kind, and we want people to have their own space and do their thing, which is actually infused in this MAiD debate and MAiD issue. I want autonomy. I want to be able to choose to do my own thing. But at some point we have to step in and say there's a moral justification for us to get together and say we need to look at this from a different angle. That what's better for society, what's better for us as community, what's better for us moving on into the future. And it's not a species of suicide, that's for sure.
Mm-hmm. I think one other piece to that I just like to add is there's this great line in scripture that it's whoever is righteous, be righteous still, whoever is evil, be evil still. Whoever does good, be good still. And I think regardless of the laws of your land, we need to have a higher law, which is, give me a higher love. It's the actual law of scripture is higher than the law of the land. And I think when you look at the lives of saints like Daniel, and there's many, scriptural examples, regardless of how dark it gets where you are, you need to stand for the truth. And I think, we're making a feature film about the life of Daniel right now, with that being specifically the message, is that even when Canada descends into Babylon, hopefully it never fully does, hopefully it sees the light, and there are leaders at the top of our nation, which we pray for and we vote for, hoping for that to be the case. But nevertheless, regardless, we need to stand for what is ultimately right. And, it is powerfully portrayed in the book of Exodus, life and death are before you, choose life that you may live. It seems almost too simple, it's like, yeah, of course, if I choose life, I'll live. But there's something so deeply spiritual about that choice. Are we choosing life? Or are we choosing death? And we do it a million times a day, all around the world, in different minutiae, but also in very direct ways, especially around something like euthanasia. And I would like to believe that as a nation, we will make the right choice.
I do think that people are waking up. But one of the focuses of chapter 3 was the cognitive dissonance at play, in terms of how people think of suicide and how people think of euthanasia or MAiD. And that's something that also Bronwyn and I talked about. I asked her this question. I'll ask you this question. But why is it that this cognitive dissonance is so strong? And what can we do to relieve it?
Well, I think I've touched on it, but essentially it's like a marketing campaign. You've got a really good marketing campaign and a lot of money pushing some of these ideas. And unfortunately, people are too easily shaped by the first time it hits you, that's your impression or that's your feeling, and that language, using that language and tricking you with the soft sell of MAiD being not that bad, even just the way it happens. And I don't know if you've got into that in any of your discussions, but like it looks and appears like it's not that bad, but what we're talking about is death. We're talking about the end, it's the last rebellion against God. That's one way I've heard it put, is to say, it's my time to die, and that's when I'm going to do it. And what it is just that it's a marketing campaign, soft selling, such a huge decision. It's like we have to reshape the narrative, and the narrative is this is a big decision. It's not simple. It's not just black and white of like anybody should be able to do this, and this is about autonomy. No, some people don't have a say. Some people don't have support. Some people don't have someone to advocate for them, and they end up dying because of it. We need to share the truth about it, and some people don't like to hear that, but it's how can you present the truth in a way to people who are unaware that there's more to this story than you've been told, and you need to be open to hearing these other ideas. So I think that's where we sit on this, is that raising awareness. For me, I was shocked at how bad it was when I really started understanding the issue. Like I like to be on the forefront of some of these ideas. I was not, and I look for this in culture. So it's been kind of slipped in underneath. And I think once people are made aware of that, then they can start to think freely and have a proper mindset around it to actually make an informed decision about what they even have as an opinion or believe about the issue, because they just aren't informed enough to know what's happening behind the scenes and with these vulnerable people who are dying of MAiD, because the numbers are quite staggering, but the numbers of people who really shouldn't be going through the program really make your heart go out to these families and these individuals who are suffering.
And it's kind of too, like, you should look to the stories of the people that are directly affected by it more than you look to the politicians and the people pushing the needle, because it's one thing to be like behind the marketing spend and be getting like a payoff when you literally kill someone. I wouldn't really take their opinion over the family member left behind who says, like, do you realize, like, and you hear that we've heard these stories that they're shocking and they're appalling, and they should be told because they wake us up. And one of them is like, if they get the concoction wrong, then the most intense suffering your loved one will have is the moment they're euthanized. There's people that it's taken 12 hours for the quote unquote 5-minute cocktail to do its thing. They suffer immensely. When you do the research into what happens, you think it's peaceful, but that's because they've paralyzed the person. When you're paralyzed, you can't react to all of the trauma of your organs melting down. We think it's something that it's not, and we have to wake up. We have to tell the truth. The truth is stronger than the lie, and the lie is that this is an easy way out. It's actually the ultimate form of selfishness. And I know that's a hard thing for people to hear. I know that it's hard for me to think of in the context of my own loved ones that have been euthanized. But guess what? Sometimes the truth does hurt. The truth can wake you up. And we need to hear those stories and keep telling these stories because, like, honestly, like, go and talk to some other people, field a few other viewpoints besides just what's coming through the media and the liberal government, because you will start to quickly be awakened like we have by just talking to people and interviewing people. Guess what? Our own opinion of MAiD has changed while we've done this. And I think that that's a compelling piece to it, is like when you know the truth and you actually are willing to have those conversations, it shifts your viewpoint. And I think as Canadians, we need to be a little bit less accepting and kind, and not less kind, but less kind, if you know what I mean. I think we need to wake up.
Absolutely. And you mentioned that people who experience euthanasia, that they're paralyzed. So that's only even half of it. I remember hearing from Kelsey Sharon, who you also recently interviewed. She was on the Jordan Peterson podcast, and she was talking about the method that it paralyzes and then it drowns the subject by filling their lungs with fluid. I mean, as somebody who's been on our side of this issue for years, I couldn't even imagine the quote unquote medical system could ever have devised like a method this barbaric. It's horrible. I mean, people will act as if the methods that are used are humane, but this is being used all across the country. Like, we're not even allowed to do this to terrorists, and we're using this on our own people.
Yeah, you're using it on your sweetest, most beloved loved one, you know. And there was actually a movie, I think it's called The Chamber, Gene Hackman, maybe we'll talk about it in our 6th episode, where they literally, and this is a true story, they literally had a campaign in America to not allow lethal injection for death row, hardened criminal murderers, rapists, the worst of criminals that were being euthanized, right? That they stopped lethal injections because of how, when they studied it, what it was doing and how horrific it was for the person that was being injected. And those were like people that they were trying to get rid of, you know, like criminals on death row. And so just to try to apply that to like I don't want that for my grandma, you know, that it is a shocking, again, like this hurts because we have over 60,000 Canadians. Like this is traumatic. This is tens of thousands. And when you really do the digging in the numbers, it's probably over 100,000 now that we're into 2025. So let's talk about a large city in Canada being euthanized in the most horrific way. And we need to have that at the front of our mind if we're going to, you know, be, I think, awakened to doing something about it for sure.
There's something that I want to talk about that wasn't raised in chapter 3 because it's such a new dimension of the euthanasia debate. A few months ago, Quebec started permitting advance requests. So someone who isn't currently eligible for euthanasia can still specify under what circumstances they want to be killed, even if they'll lose the capacity to consent in the future because of dementia or Alzheimer's or something like that. And that raises a host of whole new ethical issues because of the question of what if he or she changes their mind? How can they anticipate what a future self will desire in that moment? So I was wondering if you want to weigh in on that.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's really tragic. And I think Sanu Gandon, our first episode, he talks about how it's not a slippery slope. We've fallen off a cliff. And people talk about the slippery slope all the time. In the UK, there's this debate right now. They've actually just They're going through this in their parliament. They're trying to get a MAiD like law passed, a big one. And the big thing was like, what are the safeguards? And they've basically said they're not going to go down that road with safeguards because for whatever reason, but they're just deciding to go right off the cliff too, it looks like. And the slope, it doesn't just start with like one little thing. I mean, once you've started thinking about euthanasia as an option, anything's possible. And this is where we're at, where we're going to be pre-planning our euthanasia. That it's so mind-boggling that we're there, but this is what the warning was. Once you start, it's going to be very hard to stop that, that snowball rolling off the cliff. And so in my perspective, it's not surprising, the fact that we've talked about people with mental health conditions being there, the reason for them to get it, or mature minors. When we start saying these things, it's insane. It is insane. We need to expose that. We need to talk about this. We have a problem, we have a problem with wanting to help people. It's very multi-layered. We have a universal healthcare system. There's a major financial element to this that we're borderline not allowed to talk about because it raises too many other problems, but the cost of this is a huge factor. And I go back to what I said earlier about this is a few people really pushing this through. And when you look at these doctors who we've interviewed who used to do MAiD or did one, or the anesthesiologist who did it one time and realized it was for MAiD and said, I can't do that anymore. So many doctors and professionals realize what's happening and they won't do it. Why is that? Why are they in that position? You have to ask yourself, and why are the doctors that are doing hundreds, perhaps 1,000 for one doctor? If you look at the math on that, that's a big percentage of MAiDs by one doctor. There might be an issue there that we need to address, especially when they're being sued by the families of the people who have lost loved ones. So, it's a small group of people pushing an extreme agenda that, because it started, we have this snowball effect that we have to stop that snowball. And as a community and as a culture, I really do think that it's possible. I think we are stopping it. It just, you keep hearing the loudest, everyone hears the loudest voice screaming out here in the wilderness. We got to just try to silence that voice now and move forward as a culture and in life and choosing life.
I think I have a real problem with the mature minor label. I mean, you talk about slippery slopes, like, my goodness, you can only imagine how bad that can get. Someone made a really interesting point to me recently, that the battle to abolish euthanasia may even be a tougher battle than the one that we're fighting at Campaign Life Coalition to end abortion. It seems to me that many can imagine or have witnessed in a family member the immense suffering that is experienced by those close to the end of their earthly lives, and I've experienced that, and so have you as well. But the fact that there are adults, like a godless society like ours, that doesn't really recognize the value of life, and that it does not cease with our early deaths. We're sort of disposed to give them the right to artificially end suffering, or maybe not even suffering in some cases, right? I mean, this doesn't speak for all cases, but we witnessed particularly in your second episode. I mean, that's the argument that most pro-euthanasia advocates will put forth, and it seems that this was not sort of the original intention. But the problem, I think, with abortion is it seems obvious to most that are not in a total state of cognitive dissonance that if the unborn are human from conception, which we know they are, they ought to be defended because they cannot defend themselves and they obviously don't wish death upon themselves. But this is ultimately a question, I think, about how our society views consent. People today sort of feel that as long as someone is quote unquote consenting, they can justifiably do all sorts of horrible things to their bodies or those of others, and that this somehow is not a really grand offense against the sanctity of the human body and of human life. So how do you think that those of us taking the proper stance on these life issues, how do you think we ought to address this flawed view of consent that our society is giving us today?
Yeah, that's a deep and profound question, but in some ways it comes back to some very, very basics when you go back to Genesis and back to the beginning and see what were we made for. There is this cognitive dissonance in humanity because of that three-letter word, which is worse than most four-letter words, sin, right? We have a sin problem. And if we eradicate this view in humanity that sin is actually present, then we start to talk about autonomy, don't we? And we start to use different words that make it sound like we are the quote unquote master of our own destiny. And I think that at the end of the day, abortion, euthanasia, life, death, it is a worldview issue. And we need to recognize that, as you alluded to, we are spiritual beings, but we are eternal beings. And that is the grandest mystery of all, that these temporal bodies that we now have a spiritual and eternal component. Sure, it takes faith to believe that, but it also takes faith to believe that's not the case. And so I would encourage those that are wrestling in that debate to lean towards the faith side of, wow, what am I here for? What is a human soul? What is this spiritual component that we know is part of our life? If it wasn't, then we wouldn't have the thoughts in our own head about all of these issues. If there wasn't a spiritual aspect to all of this, we wouldn't even have this debate, because it wouldn't matter, because we would just be bodies that we can just terminate whenever it comes to it. Like you used to shoot the horse outside the back when its leg was wounded. Like, we don't treat humans that way, because there's a sanctity to life. And the fact that this has become such a big issue globally, it actually confirms that people believe that. Because why are the parliamentarians debating these things till the people are blue in the face and having the committees and the hearings, if there isn't a spiritual component where they're going like, well, what is life? What is this sacred thing that we have, that when we hold a baby in our arms, we go, oh, every single time that you hold that baby, it's a spiritual experience, right? And if you do have that loved one on their deathbed or suffering, and you hold their hand and you look them in the eyes, that's a spiritual connection. Why do we have all of this? And it goes so much deeper than that. Sort of, we can make it about like government and politic, and there's a higher thing. I keep coming back to that. And I think as filmmakers, that's what we've kept coming back to, is there is a sacred sanctity that you cannot escape. There is this eternal component you cannot escape. And why do we care when we hear that news story of like the person that was murdered in the street? Because life is sacred, right? And why do we care to even have these conversations and tell these stories? And so I don't know if any of this is answering the question, but I think that it comes back around to, we need to remember, like, why are we here? Who made us? Like, how did we get here? And did we just evolve from goo, or did we actually get formed and shaped and made by a maker, a creator? Mm-hmm. And if we did, then even more so, this is even of greater importance, this conversation we're having, because every single one of those lives has immense value, was created for a purpose, was shaped by a master artist. And I think that that's ultimately where it comes back to, is that worldview needs to be addressed.
I agree completely.
Absolutely.
I think this is one of the most pessimistic topics that we can talk about, but I find a lot of hope in the possibility of the re-Christianization of our nation. And that's a lot of what you're doing on UnveilTV.com. You've produced some amazing Christ-centered content. So I want to remind viewers that this is chapter 3 of MAiD in Canada. So if you want to watch the rest of the chapters in the series, you can go to maidincanada.org and also unveiltv.com, which has plenty of other really wonderful content. So I want to turn it to you, Daniel and Matthew. Are there any other projects you want to elaborate on? I know you mentioned you're working on a new film on Daniel. And is there anything else you want to plug?
Yeah, danielthemovie.com for that project. It's a very big, ambitious project. We don't love talking about euthanasia all the time. We did a story about breath of life, the 3 breaths of God that shaped humanity. Very uplifting and different feeling to that story. I think just because something has negative elements to it, though, doesn't mean you shouldn't be talking about those things. And so we really did want to dive into this issue and try to get the community involved. But yeah, danielthemovie.com, that's our next big project. And just like the MAiD in Canada series, we've been user supported. We felt called to make it, and we just did it. Our studio did it. We didn't have like the budget given to us or anything. We're traveling around Canada, getting interviews and producing it all independently. So any support we get is incredible. And that the Daniel the movie is funded. We're crowdfunding it and as an investment. So that project's really unique because it's going to be the first biblical epic produced by the community. And so we're pumped about that.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, that really kind of encapsulates, like, it's interesting. Slumdog Millionaire, you know, the story is being unfolding, and there's someone's kind of driving the story. And we felt that in our life as filmmakers, like the way that the MAiD in Canada series, it actually is a stepping stone to a story like the life of Daniel, because the themes are all there. They're all the same. You know, it's like the value of life, standing for the truth, being in Babylon, but, you know, vying for this holy city of Jerusalem. You know, there's these very powerful and profound themes at work in all of these stories. And so, yeah, like Matt said, if you can get to the website and whether subscribe to our content or get involved in something like the crowdfund, those things really help us to keep doing these stories.
Well, thank you so much to both of you for joining us this evening, and all the best in all of your future endeavors.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.
Gideon, thank you so much for joining me as a co-host of this Life on Film screening.
Absolutely, Josie. Thank you for having me.
So we announced our theme of the 2025 National March for Life last month, Protection at Conception. You can watch our theme announcement and speaker reveal here on our YouTube channel, March for Life Canada. Make sure you're subscribed, hit that notification bell. And I don't really want to rehash everything that we went over during the theme announcement, but Gideon, can you remind us of a few key takeaways?
I sure can. The National March for Life is just 3 months away. We are looking for sponsors, exhibitors, and marchers. Please start planning your trip today, or consider stepping up to organize a bus from your church or school. All details, including our full schedule and tickets and registration information for our Roast Dinner, Youth Summit, and first ever Save the Babies Leaders Summit, can be found at marchforlife.ca.
Join us next month for our next Life on Film screening of a locally produced short film called Veto Man, which showcases the beauty of a life with Down syndrome.
Thank you so much for tuning in this evening, and God bless you all.